Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our podcast, Unleashed, with Brian Collins. This is going to be a fun. This is going to be a fun episode because we actually have two titles, and what you're seeing up here, if you can read this, if you're watching, we're going to do it in reverse. So we're going to begin by talking about Bible translations, and then if we exhaust ourselves, we reach the end of that, we'll start talking about is God a father or a father or an enforcer? Kind of our view of God. Father's Day is coming up, so we might get to that, but probably not. So before we begin, our intrepid producer Chris Judson is going to roll the music. Definitely want this for ringtone. I think he's getting better at this. Who's that by, Chris? What genius came up with that?
So that was Signs by Mr. Dr. 175.
I knew it was a doctor. I mean, that was... Yeah. Okay. So we're going to begin with a question that came in on our chat. No, this is from our producer, Chris. Here's what he says. I wanted to reach out and ask something that's been on my mind concerning Bible translations at DEC. That's our church that we attend together, Durham Evangelical Church. I've noticed that DEC doesn't appear to have an official translation, and I'm curious about the reasoning behind this. To clarify, I'm not referring to a DEC-produced translation, but rather whether there's a specific version that DEC officially uses. While I completely understand and support the idea that people can read from different canonical versions, I think it would be beneficial for the church to publicly acknowledge which translation the elder board and teaching team rely on. I had mentioned to Chris that the entire preaching team, there are 5 of us, all use the ESV version. So Chris continues, this would help everyone stay on the same page and know where they're coming from during teachings and discussions. If you could share some insight into whether DEC is considered adopting an official translation or why that decision hasn't been made, I'd really appreciate it. Brian, I'm going to let you take that.
Sure. So I had personally wanted to talk about it because it's something near and dear to my heart. And I think Chris, our producer, I think his or question or comment is at the back of a lot of people's minds, so I have the only thing is that I think that the premise is a little bit off. And so I kind of have to, as C.S. Lewis would say, like take a longer way round to sort of answer the question. And so I think what's at the back of the question is, how do I know what God is really saying? And there's sort of an emotional need to, like, I want to, in this world where I'm bombarded by all kinds of voices, how can I know what God is really saying? And so there's a desire for truth behind it.
What is the premise that you are disagreeing with? Is it the premise that...
Well, my premise ultimately... This is why I hate when you interrupt me.
You said it. You said, I disagree with the premise.
Well,
what is the premise you disagree with?
But I'm trying... The thing is, I would have answered it if you didn't interrupt my chain of thought.
Let's all be patient.
I mean, my basic premise is that you because God chose to write in a particular language to a particular people, and there's 3 different languages, and the Hebrew part is over a period of 1,000 years, like that. In one sense, the best we can do is an approximation, and so unless we're going to be make some sort of dogmatic statement, which I mean in a technical sense here, in the sense of we're going to say that the ESV is authoritative and binding, or whatever translation. But I disagree with that premise, and behind that is the Protestant Reformation, and so like I said, I want to answer it, but I have to go a little bit further around to say that there is a noble desire to know truth behind it, but I don't think that God has given the kind of truth or emotional thing that that we necessarily want. And what I mean is for example, like if I take a step back and talk about other, I mean, they happen to be what we call monotheistic religions, but it doesn't matter. So, for example, the Muslims believe that the Quran was dictated to Muhammad chapter by chapter over a period of 10 years in 7th century Bedouin Arabic, and it is uncreated in the mind of Allah. And so therefore it cannot be translated. And so you'll see something to the effect in every Quran. And so to be a good and pious Muslim, you must read the Quran in the Arabic. And but similarly, Judaism says, well, you must read the Tanakh in Hebrew. But Jesus and the apostles made inclusive moves by, like, Jesus presumably, again, we don't know this for sure, but we're pretty sure that Jesus taught in Aramaic, which was not the holy language. It was the language of the people. And he certainly could read Hebrew, and no doubt, like, when he made quotations from, like, the Shema, he most certainly quoted it in Hebrew. But what the New Testament that we have is not in Hebrew, and it's not in Aramaic, it's in Greek. And so the church made this inclusive move, presumably following their master, of writing it in Greek so that the people could understand. And one of the things that the church did right away was they translated it into the language of the local people. But there's always something in the human heart that wants, I don't know, stability or magisterium or some kind of authority. And so, like, one of the reasons that we as a society have decided to, what is our cultural memory, and what presumes ideas of stability, and that's, well, Greece. And so a lot of our architecture, like banks, have these columns that are from Greece because it represents stability. So we want our banks to last. We don't want our banks to go out of business and for us to lose our money. And so similarly, they're like, the older sounding language sounds, more formal or authoritative to us. And so, but the problem is that the Bible itself is not written in a monolithic language. It's written in Hebrew. It's got portions in Aramaic, and it's got portions in Greek. And even within those, you can detect different dialects of Greek. And so you got Mark with very bad Greek, and you get Luke with very, very good Greek. And so one of the things that the Roman aristocracy, when they read the Gospels, they said they were used to the Greek of the playwrights that was spoken in Athens, and when they read Mark's Greek, they said this is gutter. It would be like someone from Southie saying, "Yo, kid, well, let me tell you about this Jesus." Like, and so they didn't. They said this is not intellectual enough for us. And so they rejected it. Luke's Greek is very, I wouldn't quite say it's Shakespeare, but the point is like maybe that's how you might think of it. And so, like I said, so there's a desire in our hearts to know truth, and that's very noble. But the problem is that, like, as with between any two mediums, like I think everybody can understand, like, can you tell the same story in a book form that you can in a movie? And the answer is no, because the different media lends itself to different things. And so one has to, in one sense, translate. Usually there'll be a book written, and then Hollywood will get a hold of it, and they'll have a script writer come in, and then they'll decide, what can we do in an hour and a half of movie. And so in one sense, you're translating it from one media to another. And so similarly, there are some things that you can say in Hebrew or Greek that is hard to say in English, or sometimes even impossible. And so there are some words that have multi meanings, especially in Hebrew. And so how do you represent these multi meanings in English? And there's different techniques, and I'll get to the techniques in a minute. But like I would say that it's sort of a flawed premise to say that you can exactly translate in this broader kind of sense from one media to another, from one language to another, and fully capture the depth. And yet it is an important task, and I would say that, like, the Holy Spirit, when he came at Pentecost, began that work. And so, like, we have at least at Pentecost, it's whatever glossolalia is, as the divine ecstatic language. That's not what happens in Acts 2. Like, the disciples are speaking human languages, in the languages of all the people, from all the Jews from the diaspora that are in Jerusalem for the high holy feast of Pentecost. And because the Assyrians and the Babylonians came in and scattered them, most of them ended up staying. And so there was a larger population in Greek Egypt of Jews than there was in all of Judea. There was a 250,000 Jews that spoke Greek, and they had their own translation of the Old Testament, and that's what they used. And in fact, more often than not, when the New Testament authors quote from the Old Testament, they're not quoting from Hebrew and then translating on their own into Greek. They're using the Septuagint translation to translate. But even still, I'm blessed to have been able to study Greek and Hebrew, and I can actually read just straight Greek, and there are some words that I don't know, but the vocabulary of the New Testament is quite small, and so I probably know 90 to 95% of the words, and can figure out the rest. No, just let me finish. But the Hebrew, I've worked a lot harder and longer, but the Hebrew is still hard for me, and so I have to work from an interlinear, which is the Hebrew text with an English gloss, or translation from each word. And so Greg has a lot of questions. So
No, I want to go back to Chris's, not a question, but I would guess that you would disagree with him, but you tell me. Here's what he says. I think it would be beneficial for the church to publicly acknowledge which translation the elder board and the teaching team rely on. This would help everyone stay on the same page and know where they are coming from during teachings and discussions.
Right. So I think I see this is where I start to have some issues. So over the history of the church, we get kind of set in our ways, and so the when the church was first founded in the in the first century, you had five different cities, and I'm talking about maybe the first 3 centuries. You have five different cities that were major centers of the Roman Empire and also of Christianity. And so just, going around the Mediterranean, you had Rome, you had, Constantine's city, Byzantium, and then you had Antioch in modern Syria. Constantinople is modern Istanbul in Turkey. Right on the border between Europe, and then you had Jerusalem, obviously, and then you had Alexandria in Greek Egypt, and so the languages of those church were you had Greek in Alexandria, and you had Aramaic and Jerusalem and Antioch, and also Greek, but. And then you had Greek in Constantinople, and then you had Greek and Latin in Rome, and so you had 3 languages of the church. And by that point, there were Christians from all over the world, and so tradition tells us that Thomas, the doubting apostle, made it to India. And so maybe there were there certainly were Indian Christians, and then there were other Christians, up in Iraq and stuff. And so, but the point is that that while there were other languages that Christians spoke, there were 3 major languages that Christians spoke of: Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. And so when they would hold councils or synods, when Constantine took over, the common language for everybody was Greek. And so the first time that all the bishops came together in a official government capacity was the Council of Constantinople in 325, when Constantine had converted himself to Christianity and then made Christianity the state religion. And he said, we got all these different versions of Christianity. Let's come together and say, what is Christianity? And so they came up where they invited just under 400 bishops, and they came up with an extended version of the Apostles' Creed that we still say, even in our church, which is Low Church, the Nicene Creed, because it took place in Nicaea, which is just south of Constantinople, and then later it was re-ratified in 380, and so and it just changed the wording a little bit, and so that creed is written in Greek, and it establishes the divinity of Christ, and so there were already dissenters like Arius, who disagreed about the full divinity of Christ. And yet that was the only time that the church totally agreed. And so later, what with Arius and the nature of Christianity, you get the Eastern Church, by which I mean the Aramaic speaking church. They disagreed about the nature of Christ. So we don't need to get into the detail. It was versus the monophysism versus diophysism, which is one nature or two natures.
I think we're already into the detail.
Well, I know, but the point.
Are you going to answer Chris's question, or is this going to be
it's a very roundabout way of saying that each church had their preferred versions of Scripture in their own language, and so the question is who is right. If you get the Latins with the Latin translation, you get the Greeks with the Greek translation, you get the Aramaic speakers with an Aramaic translation. Who's right? That's kind of the question. And the point is from the very beginning, the church was already trilingual. And so who's right? And so and my point is that the Aramaic Christians ended up splitting because in Aramaic what they were saying was disagreed with the Greek and the Latin people, and so the church ended up splitting. And so it would have been charitable to say that there was a misunderstanding and there wasn't a heresy. And so you have this, even today we have the descendants of these Eastern Aramaic or Syriac speaking Christians that are Nestorians that disagree about the nature of Christ. And the disagreement was fundamentally, in my opinion, one of language. And similarly, there was another one generations later of like, does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father and the Son? And in Latin, he can proceed from the Son, but he can't proceed from the Son in Greek. And so the Greek church split off from the Latin church, and we still have them. And so it wasn't until like in your lifetime, or I think even my lifetime, that the Pope acknowledged that it was heretical to say that he proceeds from the Son in Greek, but it wasn't in Latin. And again, we don't need to understand the technical details other than that the language matters. So, and the difficulty that I'm having is that probably everybody's thinking, how does this affect me? I just want to know what the text says. But the problem that I'm having is that I don't know how you get there without looking at multiple translations. That's the difficulty that I'm having.
So you would not, just to narrow it again to Chris's question, you would not recommend a church settling on one translation. Would that be helpful? Or
well,
not?
I think it depends on what you mean when you say settle. If you mean when you say that from the, when, like, for example, when there are Bibles in the pews and we want to follow along, I think that's perfectly fine.
Right.
Different
from what he's talking about. I think.
know because because at least from what I understand, he is asking a much more deeper question. Or maybe he's not, but
maybe not.
But other people have asked the question, why can't I just look at a particular Bible and say that's definitely what it sounds like? He just actually sent you an additional email qualifying it. But
I think it could be beneficial for the church to publicly acknowledge which translation the elder board and teaching team rely on. That's already been done.
Well, it is
in the purchase of Bibles to go in the chairs because that's what every preacher uses.
Sure, but I think the thing is that it may limit the potentially. Like if for example you guys are reading a commentary and it says the Greek word's this and it has a certain nuance of that, and then that would necessarily lend itself to you to go outside the ESV. And so if you make a dogmatic statement of we're only going to use the ESV and nothing else, then you're going to limit what may or may not be in the text. And the other thing is that like my point in going a very roundabout way is that I don't think that that's the kind of certainty that God has given us, because even in Shakespeare's time or the King James is easy to pick on because for 350 years, it was the de facto translation of the English world. And so I don't know if you grew up in a church that did the KJV or not, but my mom and dad most certainly did. And so my mom, even years later, even though that's not the one she uses, she has verses memorized in the King James. The problem is that the meaning of words change. So for example, the word conversation in our minds is limited to two people talking. But in early modern English, Shakespeare time, and the time that the King James was written, conversation meant way of life, which includes speech, but it includes your actions as well. And so there's there's a verse, I don't know where it is, in Colossians or something, like let your conversation be seasoned with salt, or something to that effect. And the problem is that, like, if you stick with the King James, then you're going to say, I only need to worry about my conversation, meaning my speech. I can live like hell, but as long as I talk politely, but that's not really what the whole passage is saying. He's saying, let every area of your life. And so that's the difficulty is that, like, there's no such thing as somehow a definitive translation for every generation. Just because words change, and even within different cultures, words have different nuances.
Well, even before that, you have God revealing himself to the apostles. They were carried along by the Holy Spirit, and God breathed the word to them. So we don't know what those words are if we don't have the original manuscripts.
Well,
we're already 2 degrees separated from.
I disagree. I disagree about that because, like, this is where it gets technical. So, like, I understand from the layman's point of view, and especially, like, secular, not apologists, but destroyers of the faith will make these sort of ad hominem attacks and say, well, so-and-so copied from him and so-and-so copied from him. And so how do we really know what the original text was?
That's definitely not what I was
saying.
I
know that, but I'm trying to answer the charge. And so, like, to say we don't have the original manuscripts or the autograph, as we call it, is true. But we have so many copies, like, and we can go through each book and we can say, yes, these are copies of copies. But if we compare the different copies and the different families of copies, we can come up with so good an approximation of the original autograph that it's negligible.
Well, we might disagree on that. But the other degree of separation is language.
Right.
All of the languages of the world, English and all of the other ones, were separated by language. So the approximation becomes even more of an approximation. I'm not making the case that we can't know what is at the core of the gospel or of the Old Testament, just that to say that there's a right translation, for all of the reasons you've been mentioning, is probably not. Doesn't make sense.
Well, I don't even think it's possible, even in principle.
Well, what do you mean?
Like I said, my again, back to my movie and book analogy, or for newer readers, between video game and movie, like, the medium just doesn't lend itself to being able to tell the same story, or at least it doesn't line up perfectly. And so there are some things that you can show or demonstrate in movies just by having a picture of it, but in a book you have to describe the thing. And so similarly, like, there are some words in Hebrew that you need about 6 or 7 English words to describe the nuance. And so the translator is left with, okay, well, what is the primary meaning that it means in this particular passage? And so, one of the early translators from Hebrew into Greek, his name was Aquila, and we have is fragments of his stuff, and he actually said, well, I'm gonna pick one Greek word for every Hebrew word. And it was just amazing that he was able to do that, and be consistent about it. Because you might, when you got a corpus of, 8,000 odd words in Hebrew, how do you pick consistently, and especially where the meaning changes. And so, like, one of the things that I tried to do, because I was able to I was able to learn Greek quite easily, is that I said, well, maybe I can learn Hebrew by looking at the Greek. And the problem is you just can't do that, because each Hebrew word is generally translated by 3 or 4 Greek words. And similarly, if you go the other way, each Greek word may translate 3 or 4 Hebrew words. So you end up with this enormous tree of connections, and really you're left with, well, this Hebrew word sometimes is translated by these sets of Greek words, or this Greek word sometimes translates these sets of Hebrew words. And really you just have to check on a case by case basis. And so you just can't do it. And because the nuances are just different.
Yeah.
In each case. And so very seldom can you come up with one word that you can translate it consistently.
So the idea of a word for word translation is not possible.
Well, it is, but it really pushes things.
Yeah.
And
let me just interrupt you, Brian, because to bring some closure to what Chris was saying. He says, I think there's a certain risk in suggesting that DC believes any single translation is the correct one, especially considering your point that there's never really been just one definitive version. That said, and this gets to his original point, that said, I do wonder if it might be practical for us to simply choose one translation for our purposes, just to create some consistency in teachings and discussions. And to a degree, that's been done by the purchase of Bibles that are in the chairs on a Sunday morning, and people know that that's the version that's going to be taught from. But in terms of small groups and other discussions and teachings, I'm not sure that would ever be done, because I think, I'm speaking for myself, but as an elder, I think that would kind of push against the freedom that we have to make our own choices. So I don't see it ever happening, but what do you think? You think that would be...
The other thing that I've been alluding is like the Catholic Church made a statement. So like the Catholics believe that the Pope has the authority, ultimately like passed on through Peter and by Christ, to make statements that are equivalent to statements in the Bible. That would be sort of how I'd explain it to the layman. And so the Pope has turned it into dogma, and dogma is a technical word here, which it means opinion. So it's the opinion of the Church, or there's the full apostolic authority of the Roman Catholic Church behind that the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible, is authoritative in Latin above that of the original. So if there's a particular reading that is permissible in Latin, then the Church says, okay, that's permissible. And so the problem with that is that Martin Luther, when he learned Greek and Hebrew and these things, and he realized that there was heresy in the Church, because they were following the Latin translation, not the Greek and Hebrew. And so he wrote his 95 Theses in some sense because he went back to the sources. And so the thing the scholars said of the day was ad fontem, to the sources. And so they were reading everything. Before, they didn't have like the Greek philosophers in Greek. They had them in Latin, which was translated from Arabic. And so, but then when the Turks took over Constantinople, you had all these Greek manuscripts coming in, and the scholars were able to read them in the original Greek. And so there was some new understanding, and that's just in the secular realm. And similarly, like you got scholars being able to read Greek and Hebrew for the first time and realizing, well, like it's not that the Vulgate is a bad translation. It's just that like particular ideas like purgatory and these things, like, yes, that's permissible in Latin, but that doesn't mean that that's what the original text says. And so, that the church had built up this system of indulgences of, you can pay money to the church to help your relatives in purgatory. But the problem is that the Bible, or at least the Greek and Hebrew Bible, doesn't even teach of such a place of purgatory, at least not as developed at the Catholic Church. And so Martin Luther, like in his 95 Theses, was saying, that this is wrong. And so at the heart of Protestantism and at the heart of the church is those that are able to read the original, they have a responsibility to help others to understand, what it's saying. And so the other thing is that the King James is also just as guilty as people will, in America will make an equivalently dogmatic assertion that the King James is authoritative in all merit, and then they will exegete, or they will bring out of the text interpretations that are possible in the King James, like from the King James, but are not possible in the original language. So from a scholar's point of view, it's like, well, who cares whether your interpretation is right in the King James, because it's not possible in the original.
So can you help? We got maybe 25 minutes, 30 minutes left to move into the area of the common man, not the scholar, but those who are just wanting to know what God's word says. And the translator is the in-between. Well, the translator is a scholar who knows the original languages, has access to the oldest manuscripts and can compare them and so on, come up with a translation. But you were saying before we went on air that there's a continuum. So can you talk about the technique?
Yeah.
Of translators?
So what? Before we went on air, Greg said, "Can I put them into two types?" And I said, "No." I said I can put them on a line, as a continuum between them. And so, how does the gospel? What do they say? Dynamic versus formal.
Yeah.
Is that the word they use?
Formal equivalence, dynamic equivalence.
Yeah. So I think all our listeners are familiar with like the message, and so the message is what scholars call a paraphrase. And so the author Eugene Peterson, he basically takes a paragraph and he summarizes it, and then he puts it into late 20th century, early 2000s language.
Let me just, since you mentioned the message in Eugene Peterson.
Well, why don't you just read the article then?
No. Just a quote from Eugene Peterson talking about his the message. He says, "Writing straight from the original text, I began to attempt to bring into English the rhythms and idioms of the original language. I knew that the early readers of the New Testament were captured and engaged by these writings, and I wanted my congregation to be impacted in the same way." That sounds a lot like he's suggesting that he was doing a literal word for word translation.
Well, he's lying. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. Like, I mean, better scholars than I have said, like, yeah, I mean, you may think you're doing that, but that's not what you're actually doing.
Yeah.
So I mean, like I said, I don't think it's my job to critique him, but what he's doing is in the strict definition is not a translation but a paraphrase. And what I'm not saying is it's not useful. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm making a distinction between what is a translation and what is kind of a big picture kind of thing. And so,
and maybe he wasn't saying what I thought he was saying, because he says, "I begin to attempt to bring in English the rhythms and idioms of the original language, not necessarily the literal meanings of the words, but try to capture the idiomatic expression.
Well, yeah, and he definitely does that. And so, like, I mean, he actually uses a lot of, and it would probably be a helpful digression to talk about what is an idiom. And so an idiom is a phrase where the literal words have nothing to do with the meaning.
Like, keep your powder dry.
Right. That's something Greg says that Chris and I have no idea what he's talking about. I keep picturing baby powder. And so so Greg had to explain an idiom and a metaphor. I think are more or less I think a metaphor is slightly different, but I think all idioms are metaphors. But anyway, it doesn't matter. But you know, the English idiom "kick the bucket" or "to kick the bucket" has nothing to do with kicking or buckets in the literal sense, right? It means to die. And I don't know if it came from like somebody trying to hang themselves or other people hanging them. They had a bucket and they would kick the bucket out of the way. That's my guess of where it came from. But the point is, in the hearer's mind, when someone says to kick the bucket, they're not picturing buckets or kicking. They're picturing someone die, and they're also usually thinking of a bucket list, meaning things that I want to do that are not part of my everyday life that I want to do at least once. And so a lot of people want to go skydiving, for example. It's not something that they would normally do, but they want to do it at least once just to try it. Or like some people like want to go to Europe, those kinds of things. And so that's an example of an everyday idiom that would be lost on a non-native speaker because it doesn't have anything to do with buckets or kicking. You know, and another example that I use is like when I say it was a landslide victory or a landslide election, like the metaphor obviously comes from an earthquake and earth being moved, but none of us are picturing an earthquake or earth moving. We're picturing that they're in the turnout for the voting of two candidates, that one candidate had an overwhelming majority, like 80-20 or something. And so apparently Reagan in 80 or 84, I can't remember, he won 80-20 or something like that. And so we could say appropriately that he had a landslide victory. But like I said, none of us are picturing dirt or earthquakes or the Richter scale. We're picturing, you know, people going to a voting box.
Yeah.
And so the trouble, so what Eugene Peterson does is he takes a lot of English idioms and includes them in his paraphrase of the text. And so it's very folksy and maybe relatable. But the problem with idioms is that they're very much a generational thing. And so you know, I've had the privilege of working, you know, with guys that are Greg's age, and they have a whole list of idioms that my generation had no idea, and some of them are also local to, you know, Maine and New Hampshire. And so one of them is he's got more excuses than Carter's got little liver pills. That's one of them. And another one is working harder than a one-armed paper hanger. And you know, if something's dented, that thing's stove in, you know. And so these are things that, you know, I had never heard of before working, you know, with these guys. And again, one can, you know, understand them, but I don't get the illusion, or at least I'm not used to. One could be understand them, but
can you think of, just off the top of your head, an idiom in the Greek in the New Testament?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Jesus uses them all the time. Like, the problem is that we often like kind of translate them a little bit. And so one of them is literally to gird up one's loins, or to gird up the loins of. And so the idea, the thing is that we actually don't translate it that way. So it's usually lost on most readers. So I can't hear, I know the King James translates it that way, but the idea is that in the society of first century Palestine, they had robes that went down to their feet. They didn't have pants. And the Greeks didn't have pants either. And so, like, if they were going to do work, they would literally tie up their robes so that they could move around and dig and whatnot. But when they're just walking around, they didn't need to do that. And so Paul uses the idiom of gird up your loins of your mind, would be how you would literally translate it. And he uses it quite often. And what he means is you're going to have to think and work hard about that. I mean, that's what it means. But it often, because it's so foreign to us, often translators don't even bother.
What about, for example, not an idiom, but when Jesus names Peter, your name is
Yeah, so that's more of a translation thing, because you have three. Well, Peter has four names. So he has his personal name, which is Shimon, which comes from the Hebrew Shema, which means to hear or obey. And this is one of the examples of, like, the Jews every day, even today, recite a prayer that's in Deuteronomy, Shema Yisrael.
in English Simon.
Yeah, Simon would be, and so what we have here is a transliteration, and so that's a letter for letter, and so you're trying to approximate the sound of it, and so, like, in Greek they don't have the sh sound, they just have the s sound, and so in Greek they wrote Simon, and then sometimes they add the suffixes, so sometimes it's Simonos or something like that. But and then he's also called Bar Jonah, or in Hebrew or Aramaic Bar Yonah, and it's not clear if it's Bar Yonah or Ban Yochaktan or Yohanan, which so it's either son of Jonah or son of John, and different Gospels have different versions of that, and so that's his. What we call a patronymic. That's who his father was. Bar means son of. And so his father, to distinguish him from all the other Simons, he can say, well, my father's name it's probably John. It doesn't matter. And so, like, but the problem is additionally, it is his proper name, but the name itself also means something. So literally it means, if we were to translate Shimon Bar Yonah, let's do Yohanan, it would be something like, he who hears, son of the grace of Yahweh. But again, these are proper names, so we just translate the sound. And then additionally, Jesus gives Peter a nickname in Aramaic, which is Kepha, which means pebble. But in Greek, they transliterated it, and so instead of writing with the Hebrew letters or the Aramaic letters, they transliterated it into Greek, and so you get Cephas. But because of when they translated it into Latin, you also get Cephas. But the C in the Romance languages and in English softened before I and E, and so it became a S sound. And then also the A sound becomes an E sound. So we get Cephas, which means pebble from Aramaic. And then additionally, sometimes the translators will use the Greek word to say what his name was. And Petros means stone in Greek. And so we get Peter from Petros. And so, like I said, he ends up having four names in one sense. So you have four different names to refer to the same person, all of which in principle can be translated. And so the King James actually, if you read John, the Gospel of John, it says something like, and Jesus named him Cephas, which means a stone. But if you read other translations, it'll in English, like the ESV, it'll say, which means Peter, and then maybe there'll be a footnote that says that's the Greek word for stone. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah. So you mentioned the message. which is clearly, as you said, it's a paraphrase. It doesn't even, regardless of what the author says, it doesn't really try to be a word for word. It is a
Yeah, so
paraphrase.
yeah, so scholars talk about the sort of continuum of where on the one end you have sort of an idea or a thought for thought, and then over here you have a word for word.
What are some translations that our people would use that are over on that side of word for
The word for word. Well, the most literal, which only scholars use, is Young's literal translation. But the NSAB, or the New American Standard Version, is, I would say like 75%. Like if 50% is exactly in the middle, I would say the NSB is maybe 70 to 80.
Where would the NIV?
The NIV and the ESV are right in the 50. Maybe the NIV is at 45 and the ESV is at 55. But they're both right in the middle. Between dynamic and formal, or word for word and thought for thought, however you want to think of it. Both of them are right in the middle. The NIV, that was what I grew up with, but the problem is that culture always influences our Christianity instead of us influencing our culture, and so the NIV translation people decided to gender neutralize a lot of things, both in Greek and Hebrew, and their goal was inclusion. But the problem is that like some things aren't meant to be gender neutralized, and so I feel like the ESV walks the line of like for example, The original NIV came out in 1984, and so like one has to distinguish. Well, which NIV are you talking about? Are you talking about the 1984, or are you talking about the 2011? And the 2011, like there were some changes that they made that were good. So, for example, historically they translated the word sarx, which means the flesh, the body, whatever, and they did some interpretation, and they did some correct interpretation, because often when it's used in the New Testament, it means the sinful nature. And so that was some interpretation and correct interpretation, but it didn't show you the other connections when the word flesh meant flesh. And so the ESV does use the word flesh for sarx in all the cases. And then in the 2001 or 2011, they reverted back to translating as flesh. But because of the gender neutral, and really, in my opinion, it's because of pressures of culture and saying that, men and women are identical, and there's no difference in roles, and women can be pastors, etc. And that's a political motive. It wasn't driven by the translation. That was driven by political pressure.
Would you have a recommendation to, for example, someone who is a new believer, just starting out? In fact, we have somebody in our church who came and approached us and asked, I'm a new believer. What would you recommend I use for a Bible translation?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the ESV is a really good one. I mean, when I was, it didn't exist when I was a kid, so the one that I had as a kid was an NIV, and the ESV was published in 2001. But in terms of popularity, it just wasn't well known. And I was talking with John Bergman about this, and both of us, even though we're from different parts of the country, but more or less had the same exact experience of being sort of in these Christian bubbles. And just, at the time, the NIV was just the thing. So it wasn't till I had just graduated high school, and I asked my parents for a study Bible, and they got me an ESV study Bible for Christmas, and that was 2007.
Why would that be a good one for a new believer?
Well, I think, so there's a couple things. Like, the reality is that a lot of people, for example, struggle with Shakespeare. So I think the ESV is readable. So for a lot of people, there's a question of readability. Like, and so sometimes, for example, people sometimes ask me as a scholar, is your goal to be a translator? And I say absolutely not, because I'm terrible at English prose. So I would not be a good translator because, yes, I have all this technical knowledge, but I don't know how to present that in a way for the layman.
Yeah, that's the challenge.
And that's so in order to be a good translator, one has to be immersed in the vernacular and be very good at prose. And so one of the things that C.S. Lewis points out about the English Book of Prayer is like, yeah, there were greater scholars, but Thomas Cranmer, his prose is so excellent that nobody can match the style of the Book of Common Prayer. And it's really too bad because and he talks about how it should have been updated, every 25 years, just changing a word or two, because now for the common, even in Lewis's day, 56, well, however long ago, it was already unreadable to the English church, because it's even older than Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. And so it's really a shame. And one of the things that Lewis talks about is that like he himself used to preach to basically the English Air Force, the RAF, and he had to learn the vocabulary of the airmen, and he said, I had to do it experimentally because certain words that I thought were well understood were not well understood by these men, and so I had to find out what the vernacular of them. And so he said that it should be necessary for ordination for every pastor to be able to come up with a vernacular translation of a particular passage, because it's going to change every generation.
All right, here's a question that's out of the ballpark that we've been in, and that is, what do you do for my 3-year-old?
Well,
3, 4, and 5-year-olds, let's say.
The question is difficult because like the reason that I'm having trouble answering the question is less about translation and more about content. And so, for example, like, is it appropriate for your 3-year-old to read certain passages in Judges where you have, gang rape and then the body being cut up? And
probably not.
So, like I said, it's more about the content.
Yeah, at that age, you pick and choose.
So it's less. That's more the trouble that I'm having.
Well, when our kids were with that age, they're adults now, obviously, but when they were that age, we got them. They still have it. The Bible in stories for little eyes. The Bible in pictures for little eyes. So at that age, of course, pictures are important, and color, and the narrative or the story. It was basically the stories of Scripture. Picking and choosing the stories that really have lessons for kids. And we have one now that we use with our grandchildren that is...
Yeah, is it the storybook?
Yeah, right.
That's the one my brother uses. But
yep.
So my difficulty with children is that, like, fundamentally the Bible, it's not a book for children, at least in one sense.
Yeah.
I just mean that like just from personal experience, like, until you go through puberty, you don't even know what sex is. So how can you have, but sex is a very big part of the Bible. Like that's how, like within marriage here is a shadow of the marriage in heaven, and fundamentally, maybe the central point of marriage is sexuality. So like I just don't know. you could fully understand some of the central things.
Yeah, thinking of Deuteronomy 6, after the Ten Commandments in chapter
That's
5.
the Shema,
Shema.
starting in verse 4.
You hear, yes, right, but I'm skipped down to verse 6. These words that I command you today, speaking to the people, shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, shall talk about them when you sit. So
Well, I mean, again,
the parent picks and chooses.
but again, that's it has to be age appropriate.
Sure.
So
Yeah, right.
So in the one of the things that and this is just sort of anecdotal, that like English is a really funny language because because of our history, which dates back to England, like the island of England, you had the Romans colonized it, and then the Romans left because they just lost their empire, and so the last legion left England in 410, and so you had the local people that spoke Latin and a Celtic language, and then ultimately you had all these peoples from northern Europe along the coast that spoke a Germanic language that came in, and they basically took over the whole island. And that language, which you could either call Old English or Anglo-Saxon, is the backbone of the English that we speak. And so all our basic words in our grammar are from this Germanic language. But then the French came in 1066 and conquered England. And so you got a lot of language from the Norman French, which is not different, was a little bit different from the Parisian French of the day. And so you end up with a sort of a dual vocabulary where you have the best example. And I was telling someone who's from China, and the example of like, he's like, why are there two different words for the animal and the meat of the animal? And the reason for that is that the common people raised the animal, but the aristocrats ate the animal. And so you end up with a cow, and it's called beef. And even in modern French, it's bouffe, So you can see the connection. And similarly, you got pig, and you got pork, the meat of a pig, and I don't know what the meat of a sheep is called off the top of my head, but that's very unique to English. And so and also we have the word brother, but then the adjective is fraternal, and so some people might know like a fraternity is a group of brothers, and similarly like sister and a group of sisters is a sorority. And so that's French via Latin, or the other way around. It's Latin via French. And so, and also you have the church. And so you have all these technical Latin words. And then additionally, with a lot of scientific discoveries were made in Europe, and whether it was in England, Germany, or France, they wanted to find an old word for a new concept, so they went to Greek or Latin. And so all the scientific names of animals or whatnot are Greek or Latin in formation. And so we have a lot of Greek and Latin words that were borrowed in the 19th century to refer to scientific things or medical things. And then in the legal system, because the French, we have all these Latin French words to refer to legal stuff, and even the word legal comes from Latin lex, or and in the genitive legis. So, but the native word law. So anyway, so the point is that we have this double vocabulary, but when children, I know that was a big long tangent, but children, if you look at the frequency of usage, the first 1,000 most frequent usages of words are native English words, but then the next 5,000 are French and Latin. And so children learn the native English words first. And so at Christmas, my mom had this little game where you take the name of a famous Christmas song and make it very fancy and try purposely obscure what the title. And so, for example, like you're supposed to guess what the song is by its obscure description. So, for example, Vermilion Proboscis. Do you know what that refers to?
No.
So vermilion is red and proboscis is nose. And so those are both Latin words. So red nose is obviously Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
Yeah.
But my cousin's daughter, who, was 10 or something, had no idea what any of these words meant. And she's not stupid, but she's like, I think you're just making all this stuff up. And that's really kind of what my point is that like, little kids, their vocabulary is fundamentally like sort of Anglo-Saxon and not, French. And one of the things, like Winston Churchill was one of the greatest speech writers of all time, and he would purposely use native English words in his speeches. And so, like in the great speech where he's talking about England hanging on, we will fight them on the beaches. We will fight them. These are all native, English words.
I was just going to say that for those of our listeners who do not know any Greek, do not know any Hebrew, and don't really aspire to, there is always the Parallel Bible for study, for small group. I think it's great. The Parallel Bibles, for example, is one. The Precise Parallel New Testament that has like 10 different translations. Well, you can get the Parallel Bible that has the NIV, KJV, Amplified, and NASB, which covers kind of the full range or gamut.
I mean, the other thing, and I think this is somewhat of a generational thing, where and I think it's also just a taste thing. Like when Pastor Nick was talking about this, he has a particular opinion about that there's something more authentic about having the thing in your hand.
Yeah.
And that's just not my personal experience.
Mine either. Yeah.
And so, and I think part of it is just how my brain works. And so if I hear something, I remember it. But if I'm looking at the words on a page, I have a very difficult time.
Oh.
And so for me, I did okay in English class, but I always struggled when I had to read the paper book. But then when I was a teenager, our library had audiobooks, and I would listen to the audiobooks, and I really comprehended it. And so I personally pay for Audible and have 500 titles, and I have an 80 to 90% retention rate.
Yeah.
In audio. So for me personally, I get much more out of listening to it.
And I am the opposite. I need to be reading words, but the idea of having a physical Bible with one or maybe two translations, I have mine on my phone, and so you can go from there to Bible Hub, which is an app that has all the different translations, interlinear. So there are all kinds of options.
Well, and that's it's like anything. There are different tools, but for me to set up and say you must do a certain thing, I refuse to do that. Just because my own path has been so different from everybody else's.
And people are different.
So
you're
like,
an auditory learner, and I'm not.
And a friend of mine, Brian Mew, told a story where this lady he's one of our campus ministers. So he's been in ministry his whole adult life. And he told a story, and he was a church planner, and this is when he was a church planner. This lady was I can't exactly remember the detail, and he tells it a lot better, but she basically had labored that she was a second-class Christian because she listened to the Bible and didn't read the Bible. and he was able to explain that like it's so the idea of even having your own Bible didn't even exist till the printing press.
Yeah.
And and before then, and even if you could, so even if you could read, you certainly didn't have your own copy because the Bibles were hand copied until the printing press, and a lot of people couldn't read anyway.
Right.
And even some people also, even if they could read, they couldn't write. And so
so they were read aloud.
Yeah. So
during worship
so the point was is that the church had their own copy, and someone would read it, and they use the Latin word, which is lector, which means reader. And so that was always a big part of the service, was people reading the scripture. And so, and even in Jesus' day, like they would go to temple, and a big part of it was someone reading it. And no doubt Jesus had the whole Bible memorized, but he had it memorized by listening to it. And he also learned, how to read it, but he also had it memorized by listening. And, one of the things that the Jews did, they were commanded, back in, by Moses, through Moses, by God, read the Torah out loud every year to the people, the whole thing. So no doubt it took a little time, but people were trained to listen. And so, and some people have said, we sat around fires, listening to the bards, and that's true. And so, I'm glad, and I'm grateful that, that each of us can have a Bible or multiple Bibles in our hands. But that's a very recent phenomena in the history of the church.
Yeah. Yep.
And the other thing is that not every language even has a translation, let alone ones to choose from. So English, I believe, is unique. I believe it's probably the most translated language of the Bible. I think there's 400 translations if you include the New Testament.
Yeah.
So it's it's just astronomical. Where some people are lucky even to have the New Testament in their language.
Yep.
So
So I hope that's a good place to end. I think I hope this has been helpful for anyone listening who has just wondered what is the process? What is the technique of Bible translation? There is a book I would recommend. I've read probably half of it. It's called The Challenge of Bible Translation, with several. It's written by several people, different aspects of Bible translation, including some I think you would be very familiar. I don't have it right up here. I can't think of the two, but it's available through Zondervan.
Is Grudem one of them?
Grudem is one of them. And the other one
Is
I
it
can't.
Metzger?
I don't know. And it's like it's $7.99 for a paperback, and it's also available on Audible. So, The Challenge of Bible Translation. Next week, a little tease before we go out with that incredible music that you started with. Is God a father or an enforcer? We'll get into that. Father's Day is coming up, so it kind of fits in. And depending on your own personal experience as a dad or as a son or a daughter, that should be interesting. So, thank you for being with us, Chris. Roll the music. I can't. Where are the editor was Dr. Ronald Youngblood. I don't either. Oh, here we go. Douglas Moo, Bruce Waltke. Yep, and